welcome. You're watching TV on TV. Today is Thursday, February 3rd. I'm State Representative Tommy Vitolo. You're watching Brookline Interactive Group. And like every week, we've got a great show for you. This week, we have Lieutenant Governor candidate Bret Bero. Great interview coming up in just a few minutes. But first, as always, we'll give you the news the day after Groundhog Day. President Vladimir Putin of Russia accused the United States of manipulating Russia into the armed conflict with Ukraine. Putin curbed Russia's development and positive progression. White House press secretary has addressed the comments, firmly citing Russia as, quote, the aggressor, end quote. Pfizer and BioNTech have just filed an application for U.S. FDA approval regarding a 2-dose COVID-19 vaccine for children under 5. The companies continue research to determine if 3 doses would be more effective in younger age groups. Yesterday was Joint Rule 10 Day in the Massachusetts legislature, the deadline for which most committees must decide which bills will advance and which will have to take another turn next session. Massachusetts regulators have now approved a new Mass Save plan, which will improve incentives to switch to electric heat pumps. The Department of Public Utilities have also included provisions to aid those in low-income communities in their transition. The blizzard of January 29th was the second snowiest day in the history of Massachusetts, with the majority of the state receiving just about 2 feet. Now, if we get another major snowstorm this weekend and another major snowstorm next weekend, we can talk about, maybe the greatest storm system of the decade. Tom Brady officially announced his official retirement this week, leaving many New England fans feeling snubbed by his failure to acknowledge the New England Patriots in his announcement. The Brookline Food Pantry received an $8,000 donation from the Newport Restaurant Group Holiday Gift Card Program. And finally, the new Tappan Street building has opened at the high school, concluding the use of Old Lincoln School. Very exciting things are happening down on Tappan Street. And of course, you can check out that Tappan Street building now in use when you're using the Brookline Hills MBTA station, which of course has been reopened for a few weeks now and has been rethought through in a way that I think works much better for its users. But we're not going to talk about that. We're going to talk about Bret Bero. Bret, I want to thank you for coming on the show.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Representative Vitolo.
Please call me Tommy. And let's get started. Tell us first. Tell us about yourself. What have you been doing your whole life? What's going on?
Well, thank you very much. It's first of all, it's great to be here with you, and I appreciate the opportunity to chat with you in more detail than you normally get out on the campaign trail. So I am distinctly different from other candidates. I have never run for elective office before, although I have served in town government, in local town government, when I was on the town of Carlisle Finance Committee. I have been in the business world for most of my life. I was a small business owner in Orange, Massachusetts, had a little manufacturing company there. I served on the board of the largest environmental testing company in North America. I was involved in a whole host of industries that are critical to Massachusetts, including the technology industry, the healthcare industry, financial services, so a whole range of different industries. Right now, I'm on the faculty at Babson College, where I am working with the next generation of students that hopefully will be leaders for us. And in addition to that, just in general, I am somebody who's grown up in Massachusetts since 1970. My family's here, my parents, my kids, and my grandkids. So it's somewhere that I consider home and somewhere that's been very near and dear to my heart.
So all of those are strong reasons to care about the current and future Commonwealth of Massachusetts. But there's a lot of ways to do that that don't involve being lieutenant governor. So why have you decided that lieutenant governor is the way that you can best contribute to our Commonwealth?
Yeah, it's a great question. And look, the lieutenant governor's office doesn't have a lot of statutory responsibilities, which I view as an opportunity, not a disadvantage. I think the lieutenant governor's office is what you can make it. And I decided to run for two compelling reasons. The first one is, I think while we were in the pandemic and coming out of the pandemic, the critical issues that Massachusetts face are ones that I have a lot of experience and skill sets in. I think the critical issues are what I call the triple E: our economic revitalization, our education stability, and our environmental responsibility. So I think those are critical issues where I have a skill set. But I think on top of that, I think the fact that January 6th was an insurrection, I think it's incredibly important that people that have not been involved in the political process get involved in the process. And so I decided to run for lieutenant governor. And I recognize that the battle for democracy is really going on down in Washington. But I felt like the lieutenant governor is a role where I could contribute to the public good. And so I decided that this would be the best opportunity for me to give back. And so I decided to jump into the race and run. And I got into the race before Governor Baker got out, because I think it's incredibly important for this election to be focused on the issues that Massachusetts faces and not our personal political ambitions.
So you mentioned in the bio, and again, why running, you've got significant experience in the private sector, a significant background there. Tell us a little bit more about that path of yours, and what kind of skills you maybe that aren't unique to that path, but where that path really lends itself, some skills and experiences that you could bring to bear as lieutenant governor.
Sure. Look, I think our economic recovery is still at risk, particularly as inflation comes in. And I think when you look at the Massachusetts economy, you have to recognize that 45% of our workforce works in small businesses, and 99% of our businesses are small businesses. And I think that most of the people in the State House have good experience in the public sector, so we're really long on that experience. But we don't have a ton of people with experience running businesses that actually understand how business decisions are made by small business people. And it's incredibly important in our forgotten towns and gateway cities that rely so heavily on small business for their economy that we help promote small business growth in those areas. Because look, entrepreneurs hire locally, they buy from other local businesses, and they reinvest in their community. So if we really truly want to have economic equality and economic justice, then we need to promote small business growth. That's the best means for us being successful. And I think having somebody in the State House that knows how to talk to small business leaders, to listen to them, understand their problems, and help them navigate all of the regulations required to build a business are the difference between somebody putting their business in Massachusetts versus another state, and between having their business just survive versus thrive. So I think when we recognize the fact that the lieutenant governor's skills should complement rather than replicate those of our gubernatorial candidate, then I think having the skill set that I have and bring to the table makes the executive office stronger by having that sort of experience in it.
And you talked about private sector experience. Can you give us a little detail about the kinds of industries or businesses where you cut your teeth? A little more detail on which businesses or which industries.
Sure, and I've had a very eclectic career. So I started in high technology. Back in 1988, Michael Dukakis was talking about the Massachusetts miracle on the back of the high tech industry. And I got my start, as many people in Massachusetts did, with Digital Equipment Corporation, or as DEC, as we came to know it. And that was a great place to start. In fact, it helped define it, Data General, Wang, Prime, a whole host of companies that don't exist anymore, created the revival that Massachusetts is still living on. So I started there, but I quickly realized I'm not an engineer and I'm not a salesperson. So my potential in that firm was limited. So I went back and got an MBA, and then I went into business where I was a consultant. And in that field, I touched a whole host of industries. I've dealt with healthcare. I've dealt with financial services. I've dealt with a whole host of different service companies all across the board. And so I bring a little bit of a different skill set than most people have. But after about a decade and a half of doing consulting, I decided that I wanted to have more of an impact. So I and one of my business school classmates bought a small manufacturing company out in central Massachusetts. And we owned that for over 20 years. And that manufacturing company produced very basic products. It was a traditional manufacturing company. And so I think that's incredibly important, to be able to not only touch high-tech companies, but low-tech companies, because our economy has all of that incorporated in it. And so my experience crosses a lot of these different industries, and then problems that are unique to each one are different. Having said all that, coming out of the pandemic, the one thing I can say is a lot of our government programs are well-intentioned, and we try to design one-size-fit-all solutions. So recently, for example, the governor announced a program that he would make $30 million in loans available to small businesses for the purchase of new equipment. And that sounds great, and certainly the amount is attractive. But the problem that small businesses have right now are not that they need new equipment. They have a lot of equipment that they can't run because they're having trouble getting workforce. And having somebody who understands that means that the program could have been designed differently, where we had more flexible capital that the small businesses could use to hire workers and train workers to be successful. And having somebody who understands that, I think, is the ability to design with the local businesses and the communities the program that works for their communities. Businesses are different from Cape Cod to Cambridge to Orange, Massachusetts, where I had my manufacturing company. One size won't fit all, and one industry doesn't dominate Massachusetts. So if we're really going to ensure our economic revitalization, then we have to be able to develop programs that meet the specific needs of the different sections of our state.
I want to pivot a little bit. You more recently have been lecturing at Babson College, so you've got experience educating, and certainly pre-K through grade 16, I guess, is a wide range, and there's lots of different ways we deliver education. But the fact is, you're an educator, so that makes it fair game for me to ask you, well, what about all this education? What ought we be doing differently? What are we doing right? What's your vision for, you're the second of your 3 E's. What's your vision for education in Massachusetts?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And look, I think education is so critical. And I think it's critical for us as an individual as well as us as a state. So us as an individual first. My parents were first generation college students, and they taught me that education is the path, not a path, but the path to a better life, regardless of what position you're starting from. So it's incredibly important, but it's also important to the Massachusetts economy because Massachusetts' primary distinction is that we have the best educated workforce in the nation. We used to have the best educated workforce in the world. We have slipped relative to other countries, but education is critically important to us. And as somebody who not only teaches at Babson College, but my wife is an occupational therapist in one of the Metro West school districts. So I've watched her for the better part of a decade work not only during the day, but come home and work all night getting the work done. And we've talked a lot about what are the lessons learned from COVID. So there's a lot of lessons that we have to focus on. The first one is, particularly for our younger students, they've got to be in school. Being on Zoom is too hard for students. The second point is, though, if they're going to be in school, it has to be safe. It not only has to be safe for the students, it has to be safe for the teachers. The third thing we need to recognize is that the teachers right now are burned out. Just like the medical professionals that are dealing with COVID on a daily basis, the teachers have been dealing with the classroom challenges. And frankly, they're exhausted. We're staring at the potential of a lot of resignations. And so we've got to figure out, how do we help the teachers be successful? I can think of two things off the top of my head. First, there needs to be more substitute teachers. Right now, for a lot of our schools, if a teacher gets sick, you're almost being forced to go remote because there's nobody to fill in for them right now. They're really thin. And so that's an incredibly important thing. The second one that goes along with that is we need to make teaching a more attractive industry. If our students are our most important asset, and they are for our economy because our workforce is our most important asset, then we ought to be thinking of education not as a cost, but as an investment. We want to invest in education because it is the path for Massachusetts to be successful. Towards that end, I think that it would behoove us to ask the teachers to participate in the conversation around how do we make teaching more successful coming out of COVID. There's a lot of things we've learned. We've learned how to use technology. We've learned what works for students. We've learned how to teach better because we've been forced to. When you have to teach remotely via Zoom, it forces you to have a tighter lesson plan. So there's a lot of things we've learned, and teaching is a calling. It's not just a job, it's a calling. And so the people who go into it because they want to be helpful. And they have spent a lot of time thinking about this. I think we can have a better education system, a stronger education system, and an equal education system across all the states if we spend a little time thinking through how we come out of the pandemic and move into an endemic where COVID is just going to be part of our lives going forward. And so lots of ideas to work on, but critically important to make sure that as we think about education, we're thinking about it not as a cost to bear, but an investment in our future.
Thinking about the future, we also have a future dramatically impacted by changes in climate. As I mentioned earlier in the news segment, we had the second largest snowfall in Massachusetts history within the last week, despite global warming, right? And it's because climate change is more than just global warming. It's lots of different impacts, very few of which are likely to be positive structurally. And so we're thinking about this future. Climate's certainly a part of it. You come with a business background, and so I suspect your vision around climate is a little bit different and worthwhile for us to hear about. So tell us, this is your third E, right? Tell us about climate, environment, climate, and your vision for how the next 4 or 8 years or beyond, the state can bend this carbon pollution curve and really roll up the sleeves and get it done.
Yeah, look, climate change is real. As you noted, all you have to do is watch the nightly news, and whether it's record snowfalls or droughts or wildfires or winds at rates that we haven't seen, the world is being affected by climate change. Frankly, it's also driving things like immigration. So we know that it's real, and we know it's an existential threat to the planet. If we don't act and act soon, and we've all heard this before, the problem gets bigger and almost insurmountable. If we start acting now, though, I'm very optimistic that we can make significant progress against it. So there's a whole host of things that we've talked about, right? So first, transportation is the largest cause of climate change in Massachusetts. So how do we address that? Well, obviously, encouraging public transportation, mass transportation, and not just on the trains and the MBTA. We have regional transportation systems. We need to do more of that. The more that we can move in that direction, the better. And frankly, the more that those transportation systems can be upgraded to be electric and energy efficient, the better off we'd be. Obviously, conservation is a big issue. But in the long term, those will only make a dent in the impact. We actually have to move away from fossil fuels. How do we do that? We have to invest in renewable energies. Massachusetts should be a thought leader in that area. And a thought leader not only in creating things like offshore wind, which will be important to our energy future, but also in creating the industries that will follow that change. So for example, we need to create an opportunity for people that are HVAC professionals to put in whatever new system is going to replace the fossil fuel oil burners that we had in the past. So there's great economic opportunity from climate change if we move fast, and Massachusetts can be a leader in that. The final thing I would say is this. Businesses make economic decisions, so they're not going to embrace these changes on their own. They are going to need to be incented to do that. So helping consumers and businesses cut over to new energy efficient and renewable energy sources will be helpful, but so is having standards that we expect them to meet. I go back to Theodore Roosevelt when he became president, when the American economy changed from an agrarian to an industrial society. Well, we're changing again, although from an energy side. And regulation is appropriate. Setting standards that we expect to be met is something that we have to do. And if we do it in an intelligent way, we can embrace it and get value out of it, not just view it as this cost and burden to overcome, but as something that is a huge growth industry for Massachusetts to be a leader in.
So I'm thinking about economic education and environment. And I think one place where they tie together is housing, right? When we think about workforce, if the opportunities are growing in some parts of the state and the housing isn't there, housing prices getting incredibly high. When we think about education, the fact of the matter is all of the universities in and around Boston are contributing to the need for housing, and sometimes they provide some of it, sometimes they don't. And certainly our housing choices have tremendous impact on climate for a variety of reasons: access to mass transit, how efficient the building is, how large the building is, and so forth. I think they all tie to housing. So sort of two parts. First, I want to hear your thoughts on what to do about housing as an issue, both in Boston Metro and in other parts of the state. But also, I want to sort of dial way back to your role as a former finance committee member and ask how we should think about increased housing's additional demands on local services,
Right.
and whether or not the additional property tax revenue from the residential units can cover both the operating but also any additional capital needs those municipalities have. And the contrast is places like Boston and Cambridge are building new offices for the workers to work in. So they're getting the property tax revenue from the offices, but offices don't send kids to schools. Offices actually don't need very much fire service, right, or police service relative to the amount of taxes they pay. Residents do. And if the residents don't live in Boston, then their municipalities are covering all of the services for the residents, while Boston and Cambridge and some other places are getting the tax revenue from the offices or the workplace. So how do we as a state sort of think through it being a regional problem if the revenue isn't flowing property tax style and the costs aren't being spread in the same way?
Yeah, so great question. And there's a lot to unpack in that question. So let's spend a few minutes doing it. So we are increasingly becoming a state of haves and have-nots on housing. But I'm going to go beyond that. It's also becoming a generational issue, right? So it's not just those at the lowest end of the economic scale that have trouble affording housing. Frankly, it's a generational problem. Our kids, my kids, struggle to find housing. It's expensive, and it's expensive at all levels. And there's a variety of reasons driving that. But the overall issue is that there is more demand than there is supply. So obviously, in the long term, we need more supply, but it's not just more supply. It is changing the zoning regulations so that we can make the land that we have accommodate more units to be successful. Now that then does open up the question that you're talking about. How do we balance the needs for services with the needs for housing? When I was at Carlisle, which is a very rural town, and I don't have the exact statistic, but I want to say that like 99% of the town of Carlisle's revenue comes from residential real estate. And if you put in a large development, and the other thing is Carlisle doesn't have sewer. It has town wells, which means that you need an aquifer to provide water to the houses. And that means you can't have dense populations, housing units. You gotta spread them out. Otherwise you'll drain the aquifer and nobody will have water. So the challenge is how do you build affordable housing in that town when you need to have an aquifer? And as you build it and you have very limited space, how do you keep up with schools and the other services that go with it, particularly if there's an influx of people that exceed the space in the school? That's the opposite challenge that you suggested of what happens when Boston gets the buildings, but the people live out in the suburbs. And so I think the challenge for this is not a one size fit all again. I think we have to look at the various areas and figure out what's the best solution. The challenge overall is creating more housing stock. To do that, we have to provide incentives to do it. I think that we have to recognize the fact that a small town like Carlisle is going to have different housing demands than a city like Boston, where I currently live. And so the challenge for us is to separate the funding from the need. First, the need has to be solved. And that gets to a question of political will. Then the question is how do we fund the path forward? And I think both are challenging solutions, right? It's not an easy thing, or we would have solved it already. But I do think the simple fact of the matter is in the short term, we have to provide support for those who need housing. We have to recognize that there's this generational challenge to get housing. And we have to come up with mechanisms for funneling money to those towns and cities that have the citizens, and recognize that there may need to be changes in what we zone for what the new buildings are. It's not an easy answer. And, because it is a generational issue, it's one that there are going to be different perspectives depending on where you are in your life cycle on that. Which, by the way, we can talk about housing, we can talk about daycare the same way. Daycare is a generational issue where my kids are having kids and they can't afford to put their kids in daycare and still do the job. You have 2, 3 kids and it exceeds the cost of daycare exceeds your ability to pay for it. And beyond that, the simple fact of the matter is right now it's hard to find daycares that have openings to put your kids in. So that's another generational challenge that we have to address. And yet, if we don't address these challenges, what we're going to end up with is our kids not living in state, and they're going to move out. And you cannot be in an environment where only older people are staying in state, because we equally know, true, my parents are still alive and living in Massachusetts. They're on a fixed income, obviously. And it's hard to live in Massachusetts on a fixed income. A lot of families have to move out to be able to continue to afford to live here. So we have some fundamental structural problems to address. They're not easy, but the important thing is not to come up with the magic wand solution that doesn't really work. It's to actually work the issue and begin to make progress on it. It's not as easy as just passing a single regulation and it'll happen. And we have to recognize it's going to take time to happen. But we got to start. We got to get more housing stock. We got to introduce legislation that allows triple deckers to be affordable housing. We've just got to do more to allow there to be housing so that we can keep our young citizens in the state.
Bret, you've got lots going on, and you should. You're running for statewide office, so we try to cover a broad set of topics. We're just about out of time. We got a minute or two, so hit us with like last chance thoughts. Any last bits you want to make sure you leave us with?
Yeah, great, thanks. So I'll leave you with just a few key thoughts. First, I think we're at an inflection point. It's a critical election for us. I think the lieutenant governor's skill should complement, not replicate, those of our gubernatorial candidate. And I think I bring a different skill set. For those of you who want to find out more about me, go to my website, which is bretbero.com. And that's spelled BRETBERO, one word.com. And I'd love volunteers. So anybody who wants to jump on the campaign, I need more people like you, because the political world needs more people like me. I may be late getting into the game in my life, but I think it's important that the tent open up and that people who've never run for office get involved. So I would encourage other candidates to jump in and run too. Thanks for having me.
You bet, Bret. Thanks for showing up on Brookline Interactive Group's TV on TV, folks. We're on every Thursday. We're happy you joined us. And of course, you can see us on the television or on the internet. And we will see you again next week. Brett, best of luck to you. And
Thank you very much.
I'm sure we'll see each other again in the weeks and months to come.
Looking forward to it. Thank you for having me.
All right, folks, we'll see you next week.